The moment I saw Patricia Morrison's white SUV pull into my driveway at 7 in the morning, I knew my peaceful Saturday was about to get ruined. I was standing in my garage in Phoenix, Arizona, organizing my collection of excavator attachments that I had just unloaded the day before. 3 buckets, a hydraulic breaker, and a set of fork extensions were neatly arranged against the back wall, safely stored away from the elements. My property looked clean, professional, and completely within code. Or so I thought. Patricia stepped out of her vehicle wearing her typical outfit: pressed khakis, a polo shirt with the Sunset Ridge HOA logo embroidered on it, and an expression that suggested she had just discovered someone had painted their house neon green. She carried a clipboard, which was never a good sign. The clipboard was her weapon of choice, her way of making everything official and intimidating. "Daniel Irving," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk about your garage situation." I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked toward her, keeping my expression neutral. "Good morning, Patricia. What seems to be the problem?" She held up her clipboard like it was a court summons. "Don't play dumb with me. You know exactly what the problem is. You are storing commercial equipment on residential property, which is a direct violation of our HOA bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 4. I glanced back at my garage. Everything was inside, nothing was visible from the street, and I had made sure to check all the regulations before bringing the attachments home. "Patricia, those are just attachments. They are not vehicles. They are not even motorized. They are equipment for my business, stored in my private garage." "Commercial equipment," she repeated, emphasizing each word like she was talking to a child. "The bylaws clearly state that no commercial vehicles or equipment can be stored on residential property. This includes construction equipment, which is exactly what you have in there." "Show me where it says that," I said, crossing my arms. "Show me the exact wording that says I cannot store non-motorized attachments in my own garage." Patricia flipped through the pages on her clipboard with theatrical precision. "Right here. Section 12, Paragraph 4. No commercial vehicles, equipment, or materials shall be stored, parked, or displayed on any residential property within the Sunset Ridge community. This includes, but is not limited to, construction vehicles, heavy machinery, commercial trailers, and related equipment." "Related equipment is pretty vague," I countered. "Does that mean a contractor cannot store his tools in his garage? Does it mean a landscaper cannot keep his lawnmower at home?" "Where's the line?" "The line," Patricia said, her voice rising, "is when someone decides to turn their garage into a construction yard. Those are massive pieces of equipment, Daniel. They are industrial, they are commercial, and they are a violation." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. Patricia Morrison had been the president of the Sunset Ridge HOA for 3 years, and in that time, she had made it her personal mission to enforce every single rule with zero flexibility. She had fined people for having their trash cans visible from the street for more than an hour after pickup. She had forced a neighbor to remove a basketball hoop because it was 2 inches taller than the maximum allowed height. She was the kind of person who measured grass length with a ruler and found joy in other people's inconvenience. "Patricia, I have owned this house for 5 years. I have run my excavation business for 7. I have always stored my equipment responsibly, and I have never had a complaint until now." "That's because you have never stored anything this large before," she shot back. "And frankly, Daniel, it does not matter if you have been doing it for 5 years or 5 days. The rules apply to everyone, and I am giving you 72 hours to remove this equipment from your property, or you will be fined $500. $500, I repeated, stunned. for equipment stored inside my garage. Per day, she added with what could only be described as satisfaction. $500 per day until the violation is corrected. And if it goes beyond 30 days, the HOA board has the authority to place a lien on your property. I stared at her, trying to process the absurdity of what she was saying. You cannot be serious. I am completely serious. The notice will be sent to you officially by the end of the day. You have 72 hours. Good day, Daniel. She turned on her heel and walked back to her SUV, leaving me standing in my driveway with my blood pressure climbing. I spent the rest of the morning reading through every single page of the Sunset Ridge HOA bylaws. The document was 63 pages long, written in the kind of legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Section 12. Paragraph 4 did indeed mention commercial equipment, but the wording was so broad that it could technically apply to almost anything. A plumber's truck, a gardener's trailer, even a real estate agent's signage. The more I read, the more frustrated I became. The rules seemed to be enforced selectively, based entirely on Patricia's personal judgment. I knew for a fact that Tom Henderson 3 streets over had a work van with his company logo plastered on the side, parked in his driveway every single day. I knew that Sandra Lee had a massive trailer she used for her catering business, and it sat on her property at least twice a week. But Patricia had never gone after them. She had decided to target me specifically, and I needed to figure out why. By Sunday afternoon, I had a theory. 2 months earlier, I had opposed Patricia at an HOA meeting when she proposed raising the annual dues by 30%. I had argued that the increase was unnecessary and that the HOA's current budget was more than sufficient for maintaining common areas. I had presented a detailed breakdown of expenses and shown that the HOA actually had a surplus. Patricia had been furious, and the board had voted down her proposal. I should have known she would find a way to retaliate. The official notice arrived in my mailbox on Sunday evening, exactly as Patricia had promised. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, signed by Patricia Morrison as president, and co-signed by 2 other board members, Margaret Fletcher and Robert Jennings. The notice stated that I was in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4, and that I had until Wednesday at 5 p.m. to remove the offending equipment or face daily fines starting at $500. I immediately called my lawyer, a guy named Marcus Chen who had helped me with contracts for my business. He listened to my explanation, asked me to email him the HOA bylaws and the notice, and promised to get back to me by Monday morning. Monday morning came, and Marcus called me at 8 a.m. sharp. Daniel, I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that the bylaw is technically enforceable. The language is broad, but it does cover commercial equipment, and a judge would likely side with the HOA if this went to court. And the good news? I asked, dreading the answer. The good news is that there might be a way around this, but it is going to require some creativity on your part. Can you prove that the equipment has another purpose besides commercial use? Can you argue that it is not exclusively for your business? I thought about it for a moment. Not really. I mean, I use it for work. That is what it is for. What about licensing? Marcus asked. Is there any kind of permit or license that would reclassify the equipment? Like what? I don't know. That is something you would need to figure out. But if you can find a legal classification that changes how the equipment is categorized, you might be able to argue that it does not fall under the commercial equipment clause. I thanked Marcus and hung up, feeling more confused than ever. I spent Monday morning searching through Arizona state regulations, trying to find anything that might help. I looked into permits, licenses, classifications, and legal definitions of commercial equipment. And then, buried in the Arizona Department of Transportation regulations, I found something interesting. Heavy equipment attachments could be registered under a special equipment license if they were used for multiple purposes, including personal, commercial, and emergency services. The license was typically used by contractors who also volunteered with local emergency services or who used their equipment for community projects. The key phrase was multiple purposes. If I could prove that my attachments were not exclusively commercial, they would fall outside the scope of the HOA's bylaw. I dug deeper into the regulations and found exactly what I needed. The special equipment license required proof of non-commercial use, which could include volunteer work, community service, or participation in local emergency response programs. I immediately thought of the volunteer work I had done 2 years earlier, helping to clear debris after a flash flood in a neighboring community. I had used my excavator and several attachments to help remove mud and rubble from residential streets. It had been unpaid, purely volunteer work, and I had documentation to prove it. I called the Arizona DOT and spoke with a representative who confirmed that I was eligible to apply for a special equipment license. The process would take about 2 weeks, but I could request an expedited review if I provided all the necessary documentation upfront. I spent the rest of Monday gathering every piece of paperwork I could find. Photos from the flood cleanup, thank you letters from the community, and a detailed log of the hours I had volunteered. By Tuesday morning, I had submitted my application for the special equipment license, along with a formal request for expedited review. The DOT representative told me I should hear back by Thursday at the latest, which would be cutting it close to Patricia's deadline. Tuesday afternoon, Patricia showed up at my door again, this time with Margaret Fletcher in tow. Margaret was a quiet woman in her late 50s who always seemed uncomfortable during HOA confrontations. She stood slightly behind Patricia, clutching a folder and avoiding eye contact. "Just checking in to see if you have made arrangements to remove the equipment," Patricia said, her tone dripping with false politeness. "I am working on it," I said, keeping my response vague. "Working on it is not good enough, Daniel. You have until tomorrow at 5 p.m. That is less than 24 hours. If those attachments are still in your garage when I come by to check, the fines will begin immediately." "I am aware of the deadline," I said. Patricia narrowed her eyes. "I hope you are not planning to challenge this." "The board is unanimous and the bylaws are clear. You will not win." "We will see," I said, and closed the door before she could respond. Wednesday morning was one of the most stressful days of my life. I checked my email every 10 minutes, waiting for a response from the Arizona DOT. By noon, I still had not heard anything, and I was starting to panic. I called the DOT office and was told that my application was under review, but that there was no guarantee it would be completed by the end of the day. At 3 p.m., I decided to take a gamble. I drafted a formal letter to the Sunset Ridge HOA board, explaining that my excavator attachments were registered under a special equipment license, and therefore did not qualify as exclusively commercial equipment. I cited the specific Arizona statute that defined the license and included a copy of my pending application as proof. I acknowledged that the license was not yet finalized, but I argued that the pending status was sufficient to demonstrate that the equipment fell outside the scope of Section 12, Paragraph 4. I printed 3 copies of the letter, put them in sealed envelopes, and drove to Patricia Morrison's house. She answered the door with a smug expression, clearly expecting me to beg for an extension. "Here," I said, handing her the envelope. "This is for the board. I have also sent copies to Margaret and Robert." Patricia opened the envelope and scanned the letter, her expression shifting from smug to confused to angry in a matter of seconds. "What is this supposed to prove? You don't even have the license yet." "The application proves that the equipment qualifies for a special equipment license, which changes its classification. It is no longer exclusively commercial, which means it does not fall under your bylaw. Check the statute if you don't believe me." "This is ridiculous," Patricia snapped. "You are just stalling." "I am not stalling. I am following Arizona state law. If you want to fine me, go ahead, but I will challenge it and I will win." I left before she could respond, feeling a mix of adrenaline and terror. I had just gambled my entire defense on a pending application, and if the DOT did not approve it, I was going to be in serious trouble. Thursday morning, I woke up to an email from the Arizona DOT. My special equipment license had been approved. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the screen, almost unable to believe what I was reading. The email included a PDF of the official license, complete with a state seal and a unique registration number. I printed 10 copies and saved the file in 3 different places. I immediately called Marcus Chen and told him the news. "That is fantastic," he said. "Now you need to send a follow-up letter to the HOA attaching the approved license. Make it clear that the equipment is legally classified as multi-purpose and that any fines issued would be in violation of Arizona law." I spent the next hour drafting the letter, attaching the license, and making sure every word was precise and professional. I sent it via certified mail to the HOA board and also emailed copies to Patricia, Margaret, and Robert. Then I sat back and waited. Friday afternoon, I received a voicemail from Patricia. Her voice was tight and clipped, barely concealing her anger. "Daniel, the board has reviewed your letter and the attached license. We will be discussing this matter at the next board meeting on Monday evening. You are required to attend, 7 p.m. sharp. Do not be late." The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. I knew the Monday meeting was going to be a confrontation, and I wanted to be ready for anything. I rehearsed my arguments, printed additional copies of every document, and even prepared a slideshow presentation outlining the Arizona statute and how it applied to my situation. Monday evening, I arrived at the HOA meeting 15 minutes early. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a bland stucco building with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting. Patricia, Margaret, and Robert were already seated at a folding table at the front of the room, with a few other residents scattered in the audience. I recognized most of them as Patricia's supporters, people who had voted for her re-election and who generally agreed with her strict enforcement policies. I took a seat in the front row, my folder of documents resting on my lap. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m. and immediately moved to the agenda item labeled Daniel Irving Violation Review. "As everyone is aware," Patricia began, her voice formal and cold, "Daniel Irving was issued a notice of violation regarding the storage of commercial equipment on his residential property. Mr. Irving has challenged the notice, claiming that his equipment is registered under a special equipment license and therefore does not qualify as commercial equipment. The board has reviewed his claim and the attached documentation." She paused, glancing at Margaret and Robert, who both nodded. "However," Patricia continued, "the board has determined that the special equipment license does not change the fundamental nature of the equipment. The attachments in question are still used primarily for commercial purposes, and therefore the violation stands." I stood up, my heart pounding. That is not what the law says. Patricia glared at me. You are out of order, Mr. Irving. Sit down. I will not sit down, I said, my voice steady. You are ignoring Arizona state law. The special equipment license explicitly reclassifies equipment as multi-purpose. Section 12, Paragraph 4 of your bylaws applies to exclusively commercial equipment. My attachments do not meet that definition. That is your interpretation, Patricia shot back. The board disagrees. Then the board is wrong, I said, and I pulled out my folder. I have copies of the statute, the DOT regulations, and legal precedent from a case in Tucson where an HOA tried to pull the same stunt. They lost. Badly. The homeowner sued for harassment and won damages. The room went silent. Patricia's face turned red and Margaret looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Robert, a retired accountant in his 60s, leaned forward and spoke for the first time. Can I see that case file? I handed him a copy, and he read through it carefully. After a few minutes, he looked up at Patricia. This is pretty clear. The court ruled that HOA bylaws cannot override state licensing classifications. If his equipment is registered under this license, we cannot legally enforce the violation. Patricia snatched the document from Robert's hands and read it herself, her lips pressed into a thin line. This is a different state, different jurisdiction. It is Arizona, I said. Same state, same law, you cannot fine me for this. We will have our lawyer review it, Patricia said, her voice shaking with anger. This meeting is adjourned. She grabbed her clipboard and stormed out of the room with Margaret hurrying after her. Robert stayed behind, looking embarrassed. I am sorry about this, Daniel. Patricia has been on a power trip lately. I will make sure the board's lawyer actually looks at this properly. Thank you, I said, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. The next few days were quiet. I heard nothing from the HOA, and I started to think that maybe the issue was resolved. But then, on Thursday, I received a certified letter from the HOA's lawyer, a man named Gregory Whitman. The letter stated that the board had reviewed my claim and the legal precedent I had provided. After consulting with legal counsel, the board had determined that the violation notice was issued in error and that no fines would be assessed. The letter also included a formal apology for any inconvenience. I should have been happy. I should have felt victorious. But instead, I felt angry. The apology was hollow, a corporate formality with no sincerity behind it. Patricia had tried to bully me into compliance, and the only reason she backed down was because I had the resources and knowledge to fight back. How many other people had she targeted who did not have the time, money, or legal understanding to challenge her? I decided to do some digging. I started asking around the neighborhood, talking to other homeowners who had been fined or threatened by Patricia over the years. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 3 years, Patricia had issued more than 200 violation notices, many of them for minor or questionable infractions. She had fined people for things like parking RVs on their own property for more than 24 hours, even though the RVs were not visible from the street. She had forced people to repaint their houses because the shade of beige was slightly different from the approved color palette. She had even threatened to fine a family for having a vegetable garden in their backyard because it was visible from a neighbor's second-story window. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Patricia was not just overzealous. She was abusing her power, using the HOA as a personal fiefdom to control and intimidate her neighbors. And I decided to do something about it. I started organizing. I reached out to every homeowner who had been fined or threatened by Patricia and invited them to a meeting at my house. 23 people showed up, and they all had similar stories. Patricia had targeted them for minor violations, refused to listen to their explanations, and issued fines that seemed designed to punish rather than correct. Several people had even paid the fines just to avoid the hassle of fighting, even though they believed the fines were unjust. "We need to vote her out," said a woman named Linda, who had been fined for having a decorative birdhouse that was deemed too colorful. "The HOA elections are in 3 months. If we can get enough people to vote, we can replace her and the rest of the board." "That is a good start," I said, "but we also need to change the bylaws. Even if we vote Patricia out, the next president could do the same thing. We need to add accountability measures, appeal processes, and limits on the board's authority." Everyone agreed, and we formed a committee to draft proposed bylaw amendments. Over the next few weeks, we worked together to create a comprehensive reform package. The amendments included a formal appeals process for violation notices, a requirement that all fines be approved by a majority of the board rather than a single officer, and a limit on the amount of fines that could be assessed for non-safety-related violations. We also proposed term limits for board members to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. We collected signatures from more than 60% of the homeowners in Sunset Ridge, which was more than enough to force the amendments onto the ballot for the next HOA election. Patricia was furious. She sent out a mass email to all residents, claiming that the proposed amendments would weaken the HOA's ability to maintain property values and enforce community standards. She held a special meeting to argue against the reforms, but only a handful of her supporters showed up. The election took place on a Saturday in late June. The turnout was the highest in Sunset Ridge's history, with more than 80% of homeowners casting votes. When the results were announced, Patricia and her entire board had been voted out. The new board was made up of people who had been targeted by Patricia's enforcement, including Linda and a retired teacher named Frank Donovan. The bylaw amendments passed by an overwhelming margin. Patricia did not take the loss well. She showed up at the first meeting of the new board and demanded to speak. The new president, Frank Donovan, allowed her 2 minutes at the podium. "This community is going to fall apart," Patricia said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You have all made a terrible mistake. Without strong leadership, property values will decline, and Sunset Ridge will become a laughingstock." "Thank you for your input, Patricia," Frank said calmly. "But I think the residents have made their priorities clear. We want a community, not a dictatorship." Patricia left the meeting in tears, and I never saw her at another HOA event again. She moved out of Sunset Ridge 6 months later, selling her house and relocating to a gated community in Scottsdale. I heard through the grapevine that she tried to run for the HOA board there but lost in a landslide. As for me, life went back to normal. I continued running my excavation business, storing my attachments in my garage without any issues. The new HOA board was reasonable and focused on genuine community improvement rather than petty enforcement. They repaved the streets, upgraded the playground equipment, and even organized a neighborhood barbecue that actually felt welcoming and fun. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of standing up for yourself and knowing your rights. Patricia had tried to use the HOA bylaws as a weapon, but I had fought back with knowledge, persistence, and community support. It was not easy, and there were moments when I thought about just giving up and paying the fines to make the problem go away. But I am glad I did not, because the fight was not just about me. It was about everyone who had been bullied, intimidated, and unfairly punished by someone who abused their authority. I also learned that HOAs are not inherently bad. They can serve a useful purpose when they are run by people who genuinely care about the community and who are willing to listen to their neighbors. The problem is not the concept of an HOA. The problem is when power-hungry individuals like Patricia Morrison use the HOA as a tool for control rather than collaboration. The special equipment license turned out to be more useful than I ever expected. Not only did it help me win the argument with Patricia, but it also opened up new opportunities for my business. I started volunteering more regularly with local emergency services, using my equipment to help with disaster response and community projects. It felt good to use my skills and resources to make a positive difference, and it also helped me build relationships with local officials and other contractors. One of the most satisfying moments came about a year after the whole conflict ended. I was at a city council meeting, discussing a proposal to create a volunteer equipment registry for emergency response. Patricia Morrison walked into the room, apparently living close enough to still attend local government meetings. When she saw me sitting at the table with city officials, her face went pale. I did not say anything to her. I just smiled and went back to my presentation. After the meeting, one of the city council members, a woman named Jessica Torres, approached me. "I heard about your situation with the HOA," she said. "That took guts standing up to them like that." "It was not about guts," I said. "It was about what was right." "Well, either way, I am glad you did it. We need more people like you willing to fight back against petty tyrants." That comment stuck with me. Petty tyrants. That was exactly what Patricia had been. She had taken a position of minor authority and used it to make people's lives miserable, not because she was protecting the community, but because she enjoyed the power. And the only way to stop people like that is to stand up to them, even when it is difficult, even when it feels easier to just give in. The new HOA board implemented several programs that actually improved the community. They created a neighborhood watch program that reduced crime. They negotiated better rates for landscaping services, which lowered everyone's dues. They organized community events that brought people together instead of driving them apart. And they established a transparent complaint process that gave homeowners a real voice in how the community was managed. I served on the board for one term, helping to finalize the bylaw amendments and establish the new processes. It was more work than I expected, and it took up a lot of my evenings and weekends. But it was worth it to see the community transform from a place of fear and resentment to a place where people actually wanted to live. There was one more chapter to the story that I did not expect. About 18 months after the whole conflict ended, I received a letter from the Arizona Association of Community Managers. They had heard about the reforms we had implemented in Sunset Ridge and wanted to use our bylaw amendments as a model for other HOAs across the state. They invited me to speak at their annual conference, sharing my experience and explaining how we had created a more accountable and fair system. I accepted the invitation, and in October, I found myself standing in front of 300 HOA board members, property managers, and community leaders. I told them the whole story, from Patricia's initial violation notice to the special equipment license to the election that changed everything. I explained how the bylaw amendments worked and why they were necessary, and I challenged them to think about the true purpose of an HOA. An HOA should exist to protect and enhance the community, I said, not to control it, not to punish people for minor infractions, not to serve the ego of whoever happens to be in charge. If your HOA is making people afraid to live in their own homes, if it is issuing fines for the sake of issuing fines, if it is ignoring the voices of the people it is supposed to serve, then you are doing it wrong, and you need to change. The speech was well received. Several people came up to me afterwards, thanking me for my honesty and asking for copies of our bylaw amendments. A few people even shared their own horror stories about abusive HOA boards, and I encouraged them to organize their communities the same way we had organized Sunset Ridge. One man, a property manager from Tucson, pulled me aside and said something that really resonated with me. "You know, most people just accept that HOAs are terrible. They think it is just part of living in a planned community. But you proved that it does not have to be that way. You proved that change is possible if people are willing to fight for it." He was right. Change was possible, but it required courage, persistence, and a willingness to challenge authority. It required knowing your rights and being willing to defend them, and most importantly, it required community. I could not have defeated Patricia on my own. It took 23 people showing up at my house, willing to share their stories and work together for a common goal. It took 60% of the neighborhood signing a petition. It took 80% of homeowners showing up to vote. That was the real lesson. Individual resistance is important, but collective action is what creates lasting change. The HOA conflict also had an unexpected impact on my business. After the story spread through the contracting community, I started getting more calls from potential clients. People liked the idea of working with someone who was not afraid to stand up for what was right. They saw me as someone with integrity, someone who would not back down when things got difficult. My business grew by 30% over the next year, and I had to hire 2 additional operators to keep up with demand. I also started doing pro bono work for homeowners who were dealing with similar HOA issues. I would review their bylaws, help them understand their rights, and sometimes even attend HOA meetings with them as a form of moral support. It was not something I advertised or charged for. It was just something I felt compelled to do, knowing how helpless I had felt when Patricia first issued that violation notice. One case that stood out involved a veteran named Marcus Gillespie who lived in a community in Mesa. His HOA had fined him for displaying an American flag on a flagpole in his front yard, claiming it violated the community's aesthetic guidelines. The HOA's position was legally questionable, as federal law protects the right to display the American flag. But Marcus did not know that, and he was preparing to take down the flag just to avoid the hassle. I met with Marcus, explained the federal law, and helped him draft a letter to his HOA citing the freedom to display the American Flag Act of 2005. The HOA backed down immediately, and Marcus kept his flag. He sent me a thank you card with a photo of the flag still flying, and he wrote, "You gave me the courage to fight back. I will never forget that." Those moments made all the stress and conflict worthwhile. They reminded me that standing up to bullies, whether they are individuals or institutions, has a ripple effect. It inspires other people to stand up for themselves. It creates a culture where abuse of power is not tolerated, and it makes communities stronger. As for Patricia Morrison, I heard one more story about her before she completely disappeared from my life. Apparently, she tried to run for a position on the Scottsdale community's HOA board and was rejected during the application process. The board reviewed her history and found dozens of complaints from Sunset Ridge residents. They decided she was too much of a liability and declined her application. I do not know if that story is true, but I like to think it is. I like to think that her reputation followed her, and that she finally faced consequences for her years of petty tyranny. The whole experience changed my perspective on a lot of things. I used to think that HOAs were just an annoying part of modern suburban life, something you had to tolerate if you wanted to live in a nice neighborhood. But now, I see them as a microcosm of how power works in society. When power is concentrated in the hands of a few people with no accountability, abuse is inevitable. But when power is distributed, when there are checks and balances, when people have a voice and a way to challenge authority, then institutions can actually serve their intended purpose. I also realized how important it is to know the law. If I had not spent those hours researching Arizona regulations, if I had not found the special equipment license, I would have lost. I would have paid the fines, removed my equipment, and accepted Patricia's authority. But because I took the time to educate myself, I was able to fight back effectively. That is a lesson I have carried into every aspect of my life. Knowledge is power, and the more you know about your rights and the systems that govern you, the harder it is for anyone to take advantage of you. Looking back, I am grateful for the whole experience, as stressful as it was. It taught me resilience. It taught me the value of community. And it taught me that even when the odds seem stacked against you, even when you are facing an institution with lawyers and bylaws and the weight of authority, you can still win if you are willing to stand your ground. Sunset Ridge is a different place now. People are not afraid of the HOA anymore. They see it as something they control, rather than something that controls them. Neighbors talk to each other, help each other, and work together to solve problems. The community actually feels like a community, not a prison with well-maintained lawns, and my garage. It still houses my excavator attachments, along with all my other equipment. The buckets sit neatly against the back wall, the hydraulic breaker is mounted on its stand, and the fork extensions are stored overhead. Everything is organized, professional, and completely legal. And every time I walk into that garage, I think about Patricia Morrison and her clipboard, and I smile, because she tried to push me around and she lost. And in losing, she lost everything she had spent years building. Her power, her reputation, her position, all of it gone. That is the thing about bullies. They seem invincible until someone finally stands up to them. And once that happens, once their facade of authority is challenged and broken, they crumble. Because their power was never real. It was always based on fear, intimidation, and the willingness of others to comply. Take that away, and they have nothing. I never wanted to be the person who took down an HOA president. I never set out to reform an entire community's governance structure. I just wanted to store my equipment in my garage without being harassed. But sometimes, standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. And sometimes, one person's refusal to back down can spark a movement that changes everything. So if you ever find yourself facing a Patricia Morrison, whether it is in an HOA, a workplace, or any other institution, remember this. You have more power than you think. You have rights, and those rights are worth defending. You have a voice, and that voice deserves to be heard. And you have a community, even if you do not realize it yet. There are other people who have been hurt by the same system, who are waiting for someone to take the first step. Be that person. Take that step. Because change does not happen when everyone stays silent. It happens when one person decides that enough is enough. My excavator attachments are still in my garage. My special equipment license is framed on the wall of my office. And every time I look at it, I remember that the law is not just a tool for people in power. It is a tool for everyone. You just have to know how to use it.